Hey, church family, my name is Stephen. I'd like to invite you to join us for a breakout session called Let's Create Oikocentric Spaces. In that conversation, we're going to explore one of the bottlenecks to kingdom growth, which is our buildings. And so if you're a church operations person, if you're a business administrator, maybe you're an executive pastor or a senior pastor and you oversee all of those areas for your church, this will be a great dialogue, a great opportunity for us to explore how we can better use our spaces, our buildings that we own, spaces that we don't even own, to become oikocentric and to be activating for our church family. My name is Stephen. I'm the business administrator here at High Desert Church. I've been on staff for a little over 5 years now, been attending HDC for 20 years. And prior to coming on staff, I was in the marketplace for a number of years before I felt the call of the Lord to come and work for my local church. And I'm really excited to bring you this content today. This is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. I'm very passionate about it. And so as we dive in, let me give you an idea of what it is that we're going to talk through over this next hour together. The first component that we're going to do is I want to make sure that we understand the problem that we're trying to solve. So we'll take a few minutes to really explore that and make sure then even all of the advice on the back end that you're going to be hearing, all the thoughts, suggestions, make sense in terms of the context of the problem that you and I should be solving together. The second space that we're going to explore is defining oikocentric spaces. And then from there, I want to give you very practical tips on how to actually go and then create those oikocentric spaces in your ministry, in your setting, in your community. And at the end, we want to make sure we have some time to answer some questions. And I also want to introduce you to some people that you can start creating maybe even a little bit of community with as you explore these ideas, as you start to try to deploy them at your church. I'd love for you to have some people that you can lean on and call perhaps to get some help and get some thoughts as you work through all of this content and as you lean into creating oikocentric spaces at your church. Well, let's go ahead and let's dive in. The first step is really understanding the problem. And I think any conversation really should start with what is the problem that we're trying to solve? And for us, I'm going to start with maybe some numbers. And in fact, in the book, Not My Church, Pastor Tom has a section called Let's Follow the Numbers. And so let's do that together. The first sort of metric that I want to share with you that I think we have to really be conscious of is that 80% of Americans no longer attend church. That's a significant challenge for us working in the church space to understand that only 20% of Americans are still even coming to spend time in weekend services where we all are working towards. The second piece is that 59% of millennials that were raised in the church are no longer attending church. And that probably contributes to the 80% of Americans not attending church anymore. To go even a step beyond that, we see that 35% of millennials have actually adopted an anti-church worldview. Now, for me personally, on my Oikos card, a prodigal is my brother, and he fits these stats exactly. So he grew up in the church, no longer attends, and has actually adopted a little bit of an anti-church worldview. And so, again, this topic is very passionate to me because I'm seeing this content through the lens of his eyes as we have these conversations about why he doesn't come to church. And so we'll kind of even get to some of his anecdotes here in a bit. Now, I have a few pictures here that I'll show you of maybe even depicting a little bit the barriers that exist for that unchurched person or the person that has decided to stop coming to church as they think about the prospect of attending a weekend service, even if they are doing so with an invitation from somebody, that's been praying for them, that's inviting them to church, how they perceive maybe how church is or what goes on in these buildings. Perhaps there's a degree of mystery or a sense of like, man, I don't even have a desire to engage in that, or it seems scary to me or so foreign. And so maybe these church signs even can give us a little bit of an idea with some levity about how people perceive church. So this first one says, Jesus is coming, hopefully before the election. And so I thought that was kind of funny, especially given this year. Do you know what hell is? Come hear our preacher. That's an interesting play on words. This is for all you operations folks. Whoever stole our AC units, keep one. It's hot where you're going. Don't let worries kill you. Let the church help. And last but not least, eternity is a long time to think about where you went wrong. And so again, these are some funny signs, but honestly give a good idea and picture of, again, that perception that people may have, those barriers that they have to overcome as they think about and contemplate in engaging in coming to church. Now, let's talk about some more numbers. Let's look at the church in China. So in 1949, there was an estimated 500,000 believers in China. Fast forward to today, we see an estimated 130 million believers in China. And fast forward all the way to 2030, the church in China is actually expected to exceed the church in America a decade from now. So, looking at those numbers, we have to ask ourselves some questions. Why do we see this explosive growth in the church in China, yet we see this steady decline in the church in America? And again, these questions, these numbers prompt us to have to look at really kind of this big question of, well, what gives? What's contributing to these numbers moving in the directions that they are? Now, Pastor Tom talks about, in Not My Church, some problems facing specifically the American church. And they include distracted Christians. Maybe you're a distracted Christian. I know we all wrestle to some degree with being distracted when it comes to walking in our faith. The second is discouraged pastors. Think about pastors that are having to wrangle all of these distracted Christians, trying to get them engaged, trying to get them into weekend services. And that's followed last by these divided congregations that are fighting over all kinds of different issues. And I even think of my brother who often says, it seems like the church today argues about a lot of things. And there's a lot of things that churches can argue about. And so these are significant problems that are facing the American church. And you throw then in COVID, right? Have you seen any believers arguing about anything over the course of this year? Or have any Christians you think become a little bit distracted? Or maybe pastors, have you become perhaps even just a little bit more discouraged having to navigate the complexities of COVID? And so again, I think this is a very real, very present conversation that we're having today about how do we work through these issues. Then this leads us to kind of setting the stage for, as we talk about what I want to share with you today, but 3 bottlenecks for kingdom growth. Again, Pastor Tom talks about this in his book. The first is pastors. Second is weekends. Third is buildings. Now, I might lightly touch on pastors and weekends, but I really want to focus on buildings for our time together today. And so what is it with buildings? Well, if we look at the census that was done back in 2010 of churches in America, they found that there were roughly 78,000 Protestant congregations. Now let's do some math together. Let's just assume that 75% of those churches, they actually own their own building. And let's just say that that building on average is about 5,000 square feet. Well, if we do the math, we would see that that equals almost 300 million square feet of church space or church buildings. And so what that leads us to conclude is that, number one, we have tons of space, right? I would seriously doubt that the church in China, just in contrast, has nearly that much church space. The second is that we also have the freedom to worship here in the States. Now, maybe you feel like that's changing a little bit with COVID, and that's a conversation for another time. But generally speaking, compared to places like China, other countries, we have here in America the freedom to worship. Also, we have tons of resources. In addition, not just to our buildings, we have an incredible infrastructure here in this country. We have dollars. We have all sorts of things that you would think would lead to this incredible competitive advantage, if you will, for the church in America versus the church in China. Yet again, if we follow the numbers, we see this disproportionate level of growth compared to decline between the two churches. So what is then the answer? Well, I think it's really these next statements. One is that we need more oikocentric spaces, not more buildings. And maybe it sounds like I'm saying the same thing, but there really is a difference, even though it might be even just a little bit subtle. The second is that we need more ecclesia and less Kirche. Kirche, as you know, is the German word for the church. So that means really like the building itself, right? But what I'm saying is that we need more ecclesia. We need to be more of the body of Christ. And that leads us to the last statement, which is we need to be the church, not just go to church. How many times, do you think of people within your congregation saying, will you go to church with me? And that's their main focus versus working to be the church to their oikos. Again, maybe some subtle differences, but so important and so very different in how your church family leans into them and how you as a pastor and you as a staff member to church think through how you accomplish ministry. Now, having shared the problem, let's define what oikocentric space is. So if oikocentric spaces is part of the solve, what is an oikocentric space? Well, this first statement says, any space becomes oikocentric when it can be used as a strategic and intentional platform to reach people in our oikos for Jesus. Let me read that one more time for you. Any space becomes oikocentric when it can be used as a strategic and intentional platform to reach people in our oikos for Jesus. Now, taking that thought even a step further, whether it's a local church building, a sports arena, a house, a restaurant, or any other place where people gather, that space becomes oikocentric if it allows believers to either connect with our oikos or to prepare to better demonstrate and discuss Jesus with their oikos. So do you get it? This is starting to kind of make a little bit of sense of how space becomes oikocentric. Well, if you're like me, I'm a little bit more of a visual learner, and so I'm going to put this actually in stick figure terms for you, and maybe that'll help this concept sink in even more. So it's this person with that oikocentric lens, right? That worldview, that activation and engagement and understanding how they are supposed to be ministering to and pursuing and investing and praying and inviting and preparing for working, really to reach their 8 to 15 people, right? They add then their space. So in this case, let's just say this person's home, plus their oikos, right? Their 8 to 15. That space, that home, becomes an oikocentric space. But so does this school, right? If that person is there with their oikos, with their classmates, or this coffee shop, their friends or their family, or even this workplace with their coworkers. Again, this person being present in that space, actively working with the people that God has placed in their life, that place becomes oikocentric. And even this sports arena, right? I know COVID's kind of kept us out of the stands for the last 6 months, but you get the point. All of these spaces become oikocentric if we choose to leverage them in that sense. So how do we then as a church, again, we don't own necessarily coffee shops or people's homes or whatnot. How do we then engage in trying to create oikocentric spaces? Well, I think there's really 3 strategies that help us think through the places that we have and then the places maybe even that we don't and that we never will potentially own. But how do we turn those places into oikocentric spaces? So this first strategy is launch site versus landing strip. Then I'll share with you some ideas about how do you become a center for your community. And the last is this juxtaposition of multiplication versus addition. So for launch site versus landing strip, I think the first concept we have to understand is the idea of maybe thinking about church having become a country club. Now, if you are familiar with country clubs, you know the general premise, right? You pay money, and you pay money so that way you can be with a certain group of people and not be with a whole lot of other people, right? There's an exclusivity to a country club. Well, let me just share with you, church family, that I wonder if maybe the church in America, to some degree, has become a little bit of a country club. Has church become a place that we come to on the weekends to get refreshed? I want to be fed. I'm coming to be with the people and fellowship. All of those things are great things, and you as a pastor, you've probably heard all of those comments. But should the church be a country club? Should it be a place that is exclusive? Should it be a place that's a members-only space for us to gather? A place even that the outside world, again, the 80% of people that are no longer going to church drive by and say, I don't know what goes on in there, but maybe I don't even necessarily feel welcome or feel like I should engage in that space because it's, again, sort of that Christian country club. Well, again, church family, I think we need to change our attitude in that sense. We need to become less of this country club, less of a place that is just for us, and a place that is inviting, our community to come in, and that each member of our church family should be actively inviting their oikos to come and to participate and to have an opportunity to engage in the ministry that you have been designing and working so hard to put on, in the sense, in your community. So how do we do that? How do we shift from being a country club to being a place that is inviting? Well, I think one of the first steps really is then thinking through hospitality. How hospitable would you say your ministry is? And I'll tell you a quick story. I know Pastor Tom was sharing this once, where he went to a church and he had his iced tea and he was going to speak, and that church there said very promptly, "Hey, we were so excited to have you here, but you're not allowed to bring your iced tea into the auditorium." And Pastor Tom said, "Okay, no problem, but can you just tell me why? I'm just curious." And they said, "Well, we have a no food, no drink policy in our sanctuary." And that story struck me, especially in thinking that, how then, what new barriers have been created for me to invite my oikos to come to church? If I have to say, "Well, come if you would this weekend, but here's all the rules that you have to think about, and all the policies that you have to observe." And for them, again, to say, "Wow, that seems strange. I can go to a movie theater and I can have my drink there and my food, all those types of things." And so, again, we have to be very conscious of how do we engage in very good hospitality. What's more important at the end of the day, having to clean up spills and the custodian being frustrated by that, or the fact that people came and sure, maybe they made a little bit of a mess, but at the end of the day, we didn't have that sort of country club aura about us. We instead were very inviting and very engaging for people coming to church. The next idea for you to think about is something called the oikos diet. What that means is how much of your calendar is filled with activities and all kinds of different events that are really intended, again, mostly for your church just to come together and hang out, right? This goes back to that country club idea. Country clubs, again, if you've paid money to be part of one, you tend to want to be there a lot because you've paid that money to be able to have access to that space. And so how can we instead say, you as a believer, you should be activated and you should be engaged with your oikos. If we're all just hanging out together, again, Pastor Tom says this often, we can do that to some degree really once we're in heaven, right? But while we're here, we should be actively looking to reach our oikos. So if we have filled up so much of your calendar, so much of your time participating in church activities, you are not having that opportunity to really lean into reaching your oikos. And that idea has taken us to this concept called the 5-hour box. What we did is we polled our church family a number of years back, and we said, how much time do you have each week to invest in churchy things? And the answer came back, sort of, average was 5 hours. And so what that told us is that we need to accomplish some of the really important things. Again, fellowship is very important, not discounting that, but things such as attending a church service, having a meaningful role, serving in your church, engaging in small group or that life group, like those are really kind of core central things to help you be effective in reaching your oikos. So how do we get all that done, so to speak, within that 5 hours? And that has been our focus, is to say, let's only consume really 5 hours of time. That way you can be at your kids' soccer practice. You can be inviting your neighbor over for dinner. You can be leaning into these other areas that are very strategic for you personally, that the church, if we're, again, consuming your time, you otherwise wouldn't have time to invest in that. And so these ideas then help us to shift from becoming that country club, shift from just being sort of that landing strip to being more of a launch site, being more of that oikocentric space that allows us to, again, have very effective ministry. Center for the community is our next sort of strategy. The first idea in that is availability. So again, if we are practicing good, sort of that good oikos diet, we're not that country club, it creates a lot of space in our calendar. We have to be careful. Again, maybe you've experienced this where there's sort of that program creep where it's very easy to say, oh, we've got room in this particular building. Let's start a new Bible study. Let's do a new thing. Well, really, I think, again, the idea is how do you preserve availability within the spaces that you have? And so I remember being at a church business meeting a number of years back, and one of our church members approached me and said, hey, I've noticed that there's a number of times where our campus is dark. Couldn't we be renting out our facilities? We could be making some more money. That money could then, fund all kinds of cool ministry. And I said, I really appreciate that suggestion. However, I want to remind you of what our strategy is. Really, there's two things happening. One, the goal is, again, that we've got intentional times where our campus is dark because we're engaged in the 5-hour box and engaged in the Oikos diet. But number two, we also want to make sure that we have the agility to take advantage of opportunities for our community specifically. And so we want to be able to invite our community to leverage our buildings, not even for church really related functions, as a way to bless our community and create these oikocentric moments. And so that leads us to even investment, not only, sacrificing potential revenue, but also how can you spend the dollars intentionally on ways to bless the community that, again, builds your reputation as a church, builds the availability and possibility of your church family being able to, again, invite their oikos for non-church related events. I'll give you some ideas of that here in a minute. And that leads us to the last idea in that sense is being very purposeful, looking at your calendar and saying, how are these events purposeful? What is their design to do? Was it a good idea that really kind of met a need for a season, but now as we move into a new season, maybe we actually need to turn that program off or remake this room available because we want to have, again, flexibility to meet the need for our community. And then this last strategy, before I share some real, hopefully helpful examples for you, is this idea of multiplication versus addition. Church family, I cannot stress enough the importance of thinking through the lens of multi-purpose when it comes to your ministry. And what I mean by multi-purpose is look at your buildings, your spaces, and think through how many of them are dedicated space, meaning that only this group can use this room, and kind of in perpetuity of the whole week, right? Because either the way it's designed, the way it's decorated, or even some of the furniture that's in it, like it has to be just for this group. Well, I think that dedicated space in many ways is the enemy of being able to be multi-purpose and the enemy of being able to scale, to grow, and even contain some costs for your church. So let me give you a good example. Let's say your church has pews in your auditorium. I think pews are great. They're very sort of traditional, and they have a long history, in the church. Well, what if I told you that maybe even pews are holding you back from being multi-purpose? And maybe even you need to lose the pews. Now, if you're hearing that, you're bristling a little bit, that's totally okay. Again, I have nothing against pews, but think through this. If you wanted to start having receptions in your auditorium, or if you wanted to have student ministry, or any number of different expressions of either church-related events or even community events, those pews, my guess, are going to get in the way. They're really hard to move. If you are moving them regularly, you probably have, had a workman's comp claim, or you've got one coming soon. And so if you did not have those pews, you would have way more flexibility to turn that room into a variety of things. And so that's a good idea, again, for you to think through, how do we become more multi-purpose? Now, maybe you feel like, well, gosh, these pews are really important to us, right? The founding pastor hand-carved these things 60 years ago, and they're almost really like a part of our identity, right? There's a lot of nostalgia around them. Well, this goes back to how do you not be that country club? Is this, again, more important for you as a church to feel like you got cool stuff that is really meaningful to you versus, again, let's have every building, every space be as multi-purpose, as multi-dimensional to meet the ministry needs as possible. And so that might lead you to say, maybe we need to ditch the pews, right? That leads us to really then the next idea of simplicity, scalability. How can you have furniture, equipment, even decor that is easily deployable in a multitude of different areas. So think through the ability to set up, tear down multiple different, again, whether it's reception or youth ministry or a graduation or all kinds of different opportunities. How can you have good furniture, equipment, et cetera, that help you to do that in a way that it can be deployed really almost anywhere versus having to be so specific to the room. That helps even with your staff to have knowledge of being able to leverage different pieces of equipment in different rooms and be able to, again, adjust based upon what the needs of your ministry are very quickly. And then the last piece is partnership. I think, for us as churches, we really enjoy our buildings, right? And let's be honest, sometimes we get really excited at the idea of let's build another building. Let's have another campaign. When is the next, big thing going to happen? And again, there's nothing wrong with owning buildings or wanting to build, new ones. But hear me, church family, in that, does that become a bottleneck for us saying, well, the only way to access more square footage, even if we're practicing being, multi-purpose with our rooms, is we got to go build something. Well, I'm going to challenge you and say, maybe there's some different ways that you can accomplish ministry, and I'll give you some examples here starting now. And so let's look at how do we actually then create oikocentric spaces. Let's look through three lenses. Number one, let's discuss a large permanent campus. So maybe, again, you watching this today, you're sitting at one that's very well established. It's a large campus with a number of buildings. So let's talk through how to create oikocentric spaces in your context. Then we'll look at a mobile campus, one that maybe you're setting up and tearing down church every weekend. And then we'll end with a small to medium size campus, maybe kind of sitting around that 5,000 square foot that we talked about in our earlier part of our conversation. So for a large permanent campus, I'm going to show you HDC Victorville. So this is our sort of original site. See some pictures on your screen, just to give you an idea of kind of the scope and the scale. It's 100,000 square feet roughly of buildings sitting on 50 acres, average attendance of about 3,000. And this first picture you're seeing is a good example of multi-purpose. This looks like a yard sale that got out of control really quickly. What it is, in fact, is we had a fire that raged through our valley a number of years back. We were able to approach the Red Cross and say, could we become sort of this like supply depot of food and clothes and other items of necessity that the community needed, both for people that wanted to come and give, as well as to people that wanted to come and receive. And so us being able to offer this up quickly because we had the availability and we didn't have a bunch of furniture or things we had to displace or move around, we were able to do that almost instantaneously. And so how powerful was that for people that never had set foot on our campus before to come to give, for us to be able to have conversations with them, or people whose homes were burned down that we were able to bless and minister to and come and receive, that again had never maybe set foot on our campus before. This strategy served us well in that sense of being able to respond quickly to a very immediate need within our community. This other one here is a little bit more planned, not so much kind of the emergency idea, but this is not a picture of a weekend service, but actually this is an in-service that is held at our campus every year here at Victorville. This is a local school district using our facilities to have their sort of kicking off the year in-service. And this is an incredible event every year. My wife actually teaches in this school district. And so think through the oikocentric moment, right? Maybe you've been inviting your coworker to church with you for years and they just keep saying no. And that can become very discouraging. Well, now they're coming to church, albeit not for a church service, but for work. And how cool is it to sit in the auditorium with your coworker and say, this is my church, the place I've invited you to for all these years. And for them to say, oh, actually, this isn't as intimidating as I thought it was going to be. Maybe this doesn't feel quite as much like the country club that I perceived it to be. I've got my coffee, I've got my donut, I've got the pastor who welcomed me in. We know, and I've heard many oikos stories of people that have come to faith, and they point all the way back to a moment like this, where they came to church, not for church, but for an event that allowed this oikocentric moment to happen, and that conversation and that invitation to penetrate one or two new barriers that they had in the past, And out of that, again, we see fruit in terms of people coming to know the Lord. And so that's another good example of keeping your calendar open and available, and also investment, which even leads us to some other events we've done. This is a tree lighting ceremony that we have right before Christmas. This costs money. We put together this big steel Christmas tree, and we light it up. We invite the whole community. We had over 2,000 people at our Light the Night last year. And for me, in my oikos, pre-Christian are my cousins. And so this event itself was easy for me to invite them to come to, say, hey, would you, bring your kids, let's get together, let's enjoy a tree lighting ceremony. There's not a lot of things to do in the desert where we live. And so this particular event was one that the invitation was accepted. And then what was great is on the heels of that said, hey, we had a great time. Our kids had a great time together. What do you think about coming back for a Christmas Eve service? And again, those barriers were starting to kind of come down in a sense of, he's like, yeah, I checked out your church. It's actually really great. It was a great environment. Kids had a good time. Yes, we'll come to Christmas Eve. And they did this last Christmas. And so that was awesome as I continue to pursue him, pray for him, invest. And events like these, again, cost money. They take very intentional focus to pull off, but are tremendously helpful in activating the church family to lean into their oikos. This picture here is, we've got Zorro, and we've got one of our other pastors who are reading to kids. Over the summer when it's really hot, they are reading to kids and they're enjoying free air conditioning. It's oikocentric in the sense that kids are able to invite their oikos, moms are able to invite other moms, and they just read books. And it's an incredible event that has been very, very successful. And again, we know that these lead to those oikocentric moments. And for us to carve out time, to carve out space, to make sure that, again, we have the bandwidth to have people come onto our campus is very important and very key to that ministry idea. Center for Community, you can see how we have our nurses on the left. It's a graduating class from a local junior college that use our space. We've got a graduate on the right. We've had, over a dozen graduations every summer. We have, dozens of weddings, funerals, and what you're seeing this picture here is a funeral for a fallen police officer. And again, all of these events, all of this welcoming in the community, and we do this for practically free at our church. We don't charge rent or any of those types of things. We know that these create those oikocentric moments, those oikocentric conversations. And so you might see this and say, man, that seems like a lot of work, and we're going to have to really cut a lot of programs and whatnot. That's great. Hopefully the wheels are spinning and you're thinking through how all of these strategies can really come to life at your particular site. Now, let's say that you don't have a permanent campus. So you look at a lot of these suggestions and say, we can't do half of those. Well, let's talk about a mobile site. And maybe you're leasing, maybe you're renting, maybe you're setting up at a school. But let me show you HDC Apple Valley. We actually set up at Sitting Bull Middle School. Every weekend, we kind of put together church out of the box, right? And this particular site, we enjoy leveraging about 75,000 square feet of buildings. It sits on 13 acres, and we have an average attendance about 1,200 that come every weekend. This is what it looks like on the inside. This is church on the weekend. And again, I can't stress enough the idea of partnership, right? For us to go and try to build out a campus this size would cost millions of dollars. And instead, what we've been able to do is build this partnership with this school district to say, can we have church on the weekends? Can we be part of the community in that sense? And they've received that well, and we forged this strong relationship with that school. And again, think through not just being able to access a otherwise space that, again, the church, it would take us years to raise the funds to get into, but think through the conversation with that person on my Oikos card. Hey, would you come to church with me? It's not at this building that you are a little bit maybe scared of going to. It's at our kids' school. Oh, okay. Well, that's almost neutral ground for me versus having to go somewhere that I've never been. Right? Yeah. I mean, you've been to our kids' school many times. It's in the gymnasium. Sure. Yeah, I'll come. The barriers have been lowered again in a sense, and so I can't stress enough the idea of partnership when it comes to scalability, and even the degree of the neutral ground that it creates if you're able to lease some space, from a school or maybe even a community center. And outside of church, we do other events there as well. Again, we've built a strong relationship with the school districts, so they allow us to put on big events like this one you're seeing here, where we've got slides and barbecue and all kinds of exciting things going on as we have different events over the course of the year. So even like Light the Night, some of those other things that I've showed you in other spaces can absolutely be done at a mobile campus as well, provided again that you form those strong relationships with those outside partners. So now let's talk about just even a small campus. So you say, great, we don't lease a space, we own one, but it's far smaller than what you showed us at your large site. Well, let's talk about HTC Hesperia. You can see here a couple pictures from that campus. And again, this particular site is about 5,000 square feet, so it kind of fits that profile we talked about earlier. Sits on 3 acres and has average attendance about 450. Something that's been really impressive that they've done is every fall they put on this sort of fall festival around Halloween time. And this particular site is nestled within this neighborhood that's not on a major highway or major road. It's just kind of surrounded by homes. And so what they've done is they said, let's turn our 3 acres into this massive sort of kind of carnival, if you will, that people can come and invite their oikos to have some safe family fun. And what's so great, again, is to see so many people descend upon our campus and this space, and all those oikocentric conversations are happening. This is my church, this is my pastor. This is where we meet, on the weekends, would you come with me? We know, again, that we're seeing fruit from those types of investments. And even at a church this size, you can certainly, lean into the same and similar type of strategies. In here, I also want to show you multiplication versus addition. So this is VBS that's happening in the auditorium, if you will. And so this room gets flipped, probably a dozen times a week between Bible studies and weddings and funerals and church and youth ministry and so on and so forth. And so you'll notice, again, no pews, not to harp on the pews, but we've designed these spaces to be as easily transformable into other things as possible, so that way we can leverage that space as much as possible throughout the course of the week for all of these different things that fall within these strategies, so you can see what all that looks like there. Well, let's wrap it up and bring this breakout session home. So I'll remind you, we talked at the beginning about the problem that we're trying to solve, right? So it's distracted Christians, discouraged pastors, and divided congregations. Well, I really hope that even as we then look at the bottlenecks to kingdom growth being buildings as one of those bottlenecks, you would agree with me that solving that bottleneck really comes down to we need more oikocentric spaces, not necessarily more buildings. We need more ecclesia and less kirka, and we need to be the church, not just go to church. And so, church family, how do we take that challenge to heart and think through, even in our own ministry, how we can lean into those ideas? So as we solve that building bottleneck, I hope what you'll find is that sort of your return on investment is that ministry becomes way more possible, way more simple, right? Buildings and rented spaces become far more impactful, and we encourage and we model the type of ministry that we hope our church family practices on their own, right? That they open up their homes, that they think through the coffee shops that they could be leveraging. So if we're modeling this as a ministry, hopefully we'll see return on investment in our church family engaging in that as well. So as we enter time, I would love to offer up some people that can offer you some personal help. On the screen, you see Jake Barber, our operations manager, Dennis Teese, our facilities director. These guys are heavily involved in all of the figuring out how to make sure that our calendar is balanced, that we've got room and space, and rooms are getting flipped and converted. So if you have questions on how do you guys do that well, these two would be great partners for you to take. And we've also got Mark McGee, who's in charge of all of our equipment and how we keep AC units running and all the technology to some degree in terms of key card access, those types of things. He'd be a great one to ask those types of questions of. Barbie Ingram, she's our admin assistant in the operations space. Every outside party that wants to interact and maybe even use our space, they talk with her. She also processes all the facilities requests. So if you have real kind of specific questions of how to do that well, she'd be a great person to speak with. Todd Cleaver is our campus safety director. Obviously, as you invite people onto your campus more and more, you have to think through safety, how to help them to feel safe, how to help them be safe. And so Todd would be a great one to get some insights from that perspective. And then, of course, I'm going to be on this chat as well. Would love to interact with you, see what questions you have. But at the end of the day, I'd love for you to take away from this, how can we as a church family go and create oikocentric spaces? Thanks.